Hello and a very warm welcome to the second of our In Conversation With series, where we're going in a little bit deeper and considering various aspects of collective worship in Church of England schools. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Helen Matter. Helen, hello.
Hello, lovely to see you.
So great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining. So I wonder, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, first of all, I guess I live in Suffolk, which is on the east coast. I have a background in teaching in middle and primary schools. I've been an RE advisor. I've written curriculum materials, and I'm an avid assembly taker and storyteller. Someone who really enjoys and is fascinated by collective worship.
Amazing. I know you've got so much wisdom to share with us, Helen, so I'm so thrilled that you could join us. So in this session, I've been meeting with various teachers and collective worship leads in schools and thinking, how can we support you the most at this time? And I've really got a sense that for many teachers, particularly the last term, it's been the first time that they've been asked to lead class-based collective worship. And I know from my own experience that in initial teacher training or education, we're lucky if we get a good few seconds on it. I know I had about 10 minutes and I even question how good that actually was. So I wonder, for you, what is collective worship and why do we do it?
Well, I guess I would have to start by saying collective worship is a statutory requirement in all schools. But more importantly, for those of us working in church schools, I like to use the analogy of worship as being the beating heart of school life, something which pulls pupils and staff together and pumps life out into the school. If you look at government documents, then you will see that schools are tasked with aiming to provide the opportunity for pupils to worship God, to consider spiritual and moral issues, to explore their own beliefs, to promote common ethos and shared values. But in a church school, I think we need to be clear that we're expected to provide Christian collective worship. Not exactly what you'd find in a church, but it must involve opportunities to worship God. And why might that be important to us? Well, for a Christian, worship is response to a God who loves them and is interested in every aspect of lives. So why wouldn't he be interested in what we're doing in school and in how we feel and the issues that we face? So to have time spent with him, learning from God and interacting with God, if you like, why wouldn't that be an important part of school life? And worship in school might mean anything from giving thanks to God, praise of God, contemplation, reflection, celebration, or even silence before God. And because it's Christian worship, it should also be something which draws on the stories of Jesus and traditional Christian prayers, maybe collects or the Lord's Prayer. And it'll involve things like celebrating the Christian seasons like Advent, maybe.
Okay, thank you, Helen. I think that's a really clear articulation of what collective worship is and can be in Church of England schools. Now, I wonder what might be useful for teachers in thinking about the planning of collective worship, because I know as teachers we quite like to have a bit of a framework where we can hang things on. We're used to planning and we're used to doing things in some steps which we think is most fruitful and purposeful. And I know there's lots of models and frameworks for collective worship out there. And I wonder, is there a particular model which has stood out for you as being particularly useful?
Yes, there is. We worked particularly on one which was based on a traditional liturgy or form of worship in the Church of England. And it's summarised by the four letters GERS, GERS, which stand for gather, engage, respond, and send. And I've found those four elements really, really useful. And I use it myself when I'm thinking about what I'm going to do in worship. And I think children also find it a very easy thing to use. It helps them plan. So G is for gather, and gather means thinking about how we're going to get everybody together to begin our worship, and then the words or the music or the song that we're going to use to start what we're doing. It might involve a signal like a bell or the beginning of a piece of music to gather people together. I know one class that has a song that it sings, Lord, we've come to worship you, Lord, we've come to pray, just to gather everyone together. So gather. The second one, E, is engage. And that's the kind of thing, the kind of time when you might tell a story, you might listen to a prayer and talk about it. You engage with some Christian material. R is for respond, and it's the time when you might respond with a prayer. You might spend time reflecting. I love it when there's a prayer action. And one of my favourites in classroom worship used to be, I had a very long rope and we used to pass it around the class, threading it around so that everybody was holding on to it. And then everybody would think of their own prayer and tie a little ribbon onto the rope so that everybody's prayers were there as a response to what we'd said. And I have seen in some schools, in class, they have their own tiny little battery candles and switch those on for the response time. So it's quite clear that that's what they're doing. This is their moment with God. And while their candle is on, they can say their own quiet prayers, or you might say a prayer together. So that's the respond section. And then you reach the end of your worship with send, S for send. And it's not just a finishing time as much as an opportunity to say a blessing together or decide what it is that you've learnt and what you're taking with you into the day. Taking the promise of God, if you like, out with you, packing to go out into the next part of your life. So it is a concrete part of the collective worship. So you've got gather, engage, respond, and send. And I think that structure is in many ways, it's comforting for the teacher and the children to know that they're working through something. You have a sense of security. That's what I like about it, having that sense of security. And it's also really, really quick. So it could be something you use when you're doing detailed planning months in advance, or it could be something that, you know, you've come in and it's been the most disastrous time for getting ready for anything. And you can still have in your mind that sense of gather, engage, respond, send. And so you can start with a greeting, you can grab that story and engage with the children. You can offer them the chance to respond through some silence or through a prayer that you say together, and you can send them out with some words of greeting. So it's both a long-term planning tool and almost an emergency planning tool.
Yeah, that's absolutely great, Helen. Thank you. And certainly I found using the GERS framework quite useful for me in thinking about collective worship, because not least you've got that comfort of that core structure and flow, but also it helps sidestep the risk that collective worship becomes a sense of a performing art where you're just there to entertain. But actually collective worship, it can certainly be entertaining, but it has to have that reflection and engagement with biblical material. And then I like the S as the so what, you know, what are we going to do now? We've had this amazing time together. What's this made us think about? What's this made us, you know, what's it challenged us to do and think? So that kind of leads on to my next question then, in that we might have a framework such as GERS, but sometimes we might fall into risk of it becoming quite samey. And this is what we do, but we do the same thing every single day. And sometimes it needs a little bit of a shake up. So it's been interesting to explore with schools how to get that kind of that shared framework, and which is a sense of security, but at the same time, have a bit of variety in there. I wonder what your thoughts are there. How can we support teachers or think as us in schools of having this shared framework, but getting a bit of diversity in there at the same time?
Well, If you think first of all of a whole school approach to worship rather than just classroom, I guess we would want to remember that we're part of something bigger, and there needs to be an overall plan to your school's collective worship, an overall plan into which you fit maybe with your classroom worship that you're leading. So I think you need to be aware, first of all, of what the whole school worship plan is, and to discuss that, as a staff, how is your worship organised across a whole week so that it's different? And we have a tendency to think, for example, in terms of size of school groups. So you might go, Monday, whole school worship. Tuesday, go back to your class, have class worship. Wednesday might be whole school, might be year group, depending on the size of your school. You might go to a singing assembly, maybe a key stage one on a Thursday, and then all get together again for a celebration. So you've got a sense of variety there. That doesn't mean that if you are doing collective worship in a classroom, you have to have all those different kinds of variety, because you're fitting into a particular slot. One of the things that I think is quite helpful to think about is, rather than the size of your assemblies or your collective worship during the course of the week, is to think, what kind of an aspect of worship do they represent? So your big worship on a Monday morning might be proclamation. Sounds a bit grand, doesn't it? But the announcing of the good news of Jesus Christ, for example, the proclaiming of what it is the Bible says about, or what this particular story says. So proclamation as the big assembly at the beginning of the week, which then might lead into classroom assembly, which is worship as reflection, as thinking about. And it might lead on Wednesday into worship as prayer, maybe particularly prayer for other people, intercession. And Thursday might be worship as praise. There's your singing assembly. And then Friday, worship as celebration. So you're thinking about a flavour of worship. Now, if you were doing your classroom assembly, your classroom collective worship on a Tuesday, you might be then thinking of planning a series of half a dozen, that's half a term's worth, of assemblies which were reflective. That would be your responsibility. And you could vary within those collective worships the ways in which you reflect, but you're not responsible for having the great proclamation assembly or the great, do you see what I mean? So I would say, if you were doing classroom collective worship, think about what is the flavour of the worship that you are providing into the whole school picture, and then look at the elements of gather, engage, respond and send, and seek to find a little bit of variety there. But you might want to create the variety by changing something each half term, so the children have got the chance to relax into something. Because if this collective worship time is going to be anything, it needs to be something that is not stressing you out. So don't go for variety where you change everything every day. Take your time, relax into it. So talk to the children about different kinds of gatherings that there might be, the ringing of a bell or the singing of a particular song, and select one that you use for that half term. Choose a way of reflecting on what's been talked about maybe on the Monday assembly, and choose one way of doing it, or choose a complementary series of stories to tell for your particular collective worship, and share those gently. Get different children to read the stories for you if it's in class. So you create variety in the response section by using different ways of praying, maybe singing a prayer, maybe signing a prayer, maybe reading a traditional prayer, maybe the children writing a prayer, maybe writing or drawing a quiet prayer, which you can stick up as a post-it or place in front of your classroom candle or cross. But look for small varieties within the bigger structure. That should keep you busy.
That's amazing, Helen. I wish I could have heard that wisdom when I was facilitating class-based worship with my lovely year 5s and 6s. I think that phrase of, having simple bits of variety, but also knowing what the bigger picture is across the school provision. I think that's really important to be mindful of. So my next question then is just simply, what's your key wisdom and advice that you'd like to give schools at this time in thinking about class-based worship? Are there any kind of key messages that you'd like to give, or perhaps even some practical ideas that you'd like to share?
Well, maybe let's start with some practical ideas. So I think if you want to get yourself settled into the ideas of doing collective worship in your classroom, the best place to start is actually in July. So when you meet a new class, why not introduce them to what is going to be, you hope, your classroom worship practice when they come to you in September. So, for example, you might have a box or a basket in which you keep the artifacts, the items that you're going to set out as a focus for your collective worship. So why not introduce them to that classroom assembly box actually in July? Maybe you'll have a cross in there that you can show them, some coloured underlay, a picture Bible. One of the things that I thought was really nice in one school that I was in was they had a catalogue with candles in. And in July, with their new teacher, they actually chose and ordered their collective worship candle so that it arrived and was there for them to open at their first collective worship. And I thought that's a really practical thing to get you started. I think another practical thing is to decide from your perspective when during the day, if it's possible for you to decide that, when during the day do you want your collective worship? So maybe you want to vary it, but I'm thinking in terms of, do you want collective worship as a quiet start to the day, as a team talk for the beginning of the day, that kind of style? Do you want it as an oasis somewhere in the middle of the day where you can all just stop for a moment? Do you want it at the end of the day as a drawing together of your day, or as a reflection back on what has happened? So that kind of thing, I think, is something that's really practical to think about. The other thing, practicalities, is to remember that quite often it's helpful to have something to hold or to look at, but particularly to hold. There's a tradition in some Christian circles of having, for example, beads, rosaries to hold. But I've seen things in school which I've particularly liked, for example, where children are given the opportunity to hold a small wooden heart, or to choose to hold a small wooden cross during prayer time, or they're invited to write a prayer on a post-it note and place it in front of the cross, or to pass around. In one early years classroom, they had a prayer bear and they passed the prayer bear round while prayers were being said. All of those things are practical things that the children can hold. I think are really, really good practical advice. And one of the places you might want to go to for prayer activities like that might be something like the prayer spaces in schools websites, where they have lots of activity things that the children can do quickly during collective worship. So those are the practical ideas. Do you want me to give you my sort of top wisdom ideas as well while I'm at it?
Absolutely. Yes, please.
Okay, so I think really important, please remember that worship is not a lesson. Don't go for endless philosophy for children questions and discussion things. Don't write notes everywhere, about what you're learning, because I think that turns your worship back into a lesson. And this isn't a lesson. It's a time for nourishing and celebrating faith. If you're the teacher, obviously you are the teacher in the worship situation, remember you come to worship on the same level as the children. It's maybe the one opportunity in school where you come together to do something where nobody is really the boss. So do allow the children to help you to lead worship. And if you are a Christian, see it as something that nourishes your own faith journey. Sometimes it's nice to bring in the clergy, the vicars as well, and not ask them to lead, but ask them to sit and to be part of your class worship. If you're not a Christian, or if you're a member of another faith, or you're an atheist, agnostic, somehow still having to lead collective worship, then prepare it as well as you can and allow yourself to find space to think about where you are on your own journey through life. And I think I would add in to all of this, remember that it may only be a short time. There's no reason why your collective worship should be any longer than 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes maximum. But all of that time adds up. I used to say to some of the people that I was training, if you added it all up, do you know how much collective worship time there is over the course of the year? 15 minutes of class worship a day, an hour and a quarter a week, 45 hours a year, 7 times that in a primary school. This isn't time that should be wasted. It's time that needs to be made something of. In Christian terms, it's worthwhile because it is giving worth to God. But surely it's worthwhile in any child's life, in any adult's life, to have time to step back, to think, to reflect, to look at your purpose in life. And it really is worth crafting this time and making it something special. Maybe I could just finish what I'm saying with a story that I think to me illustrates something of the importance of what those very few minutes of collective worship might mean. It's a story about somebody who is visiting the site of a cathedral which is being built. And he walks past where the stonemasons are working, and he stops at one particular man and says, "So what are you doing?" And the first stonemason says, "Well, I'm just squaring up this block." And he goes on chipping away at the side of the block, squaring it up, ready for use. The visitor passes on to another of the stonemasons and engages him with the same question. "So what are you doing?" And the second stonemason looks thoughtful, looks up at the questioner and says, "Well, I'm building a cathedral." And I think when we think about collective worship, we need to remember that it's not just the 15 minutes. We're actually making a contribution to something quite immense, the whole length of a child's life. And that makes it really, really worthwhile taking time to think about collective worship and to craft it in a way that we'd all be proud of, actually.
Well, that's such a great analogy. And I just want to thank you, Helen. You've touched on so many things, and you've certainly really inspired me in thinking about, what amazing collective worship can be, and some of those big questions that we can really sit with and simmer and, really think about how can we craft this to be something incredible for our pupils, something that we can really cherish and treasure. So thank you so much for joining us and for
You're welcome.
for being you and sharing your wisdom. And I know this is, it's been so helpful for me, and I'm sure it'll be so helpful to all of us in the diocese as well. So thank you ever so much.
You're welcome.